I try not to watch Piers Morgan, the infamous UK-based commentator who has made essentially a living promoting a kind of liberal justification for the US and UK and essentially the collective West's imperial regime. And this has not been any more clear or stark, and perhaps just absolutely grotesquely so, than in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. He has made a name in low key. British Iraqi rapper has been on this program more than a few times talking about how Piers Morgan has pretty deep connections to the Israeli side. But nonetheless, he has played this role of being kind of a middleman, someone who poses as a good-hearted fellow that just continuously rebrands Israel, the United States, and the UK's talking points to justify this ongoing catastrophe in Gaza, as well as its regional implications. Well, Piers Morgan has, of course, interviewed people like Norman Finkelstein and hosted debates, including people like Norman Finkelstein, the infamous former professor who is an expert on the situation in Gaza. And it hasn't gone so well for Piers Morgan. Well, he met his match, and incredibly so, from political scientists, the renowned political scientist John Mearsheimer. And John Mearsheimer came on the Piers Morgan show and absolutely destroyed anything and everything that Piers Morgan tried to throw at him. And I wanted to cover this because we are hearing a narrative of late, both in regards to Israel, what it's doing in Gaza, as well as what the United States, Israel, and of course the collective West are doing in the Middle East to Iran, for example. A narrative that says that the United States and the West and Israel all have a duty, even if it's not correct how they go about this duty, but they have a duty to ensure that future war crimes, that future catastrophes, that future disasters in the region are prevented from these evil, barbaric forces, whether it be Hamas or Iran, etc. And I want to play you how John Mearsheimer answered this because I thought it was an absolutely brilliant segment. And I have more than a few of these. So let me pull up the first, okay? So let's see if I got this right one here. Here we go. Yes. So here's what he had to say when Piers Morgan, and this is from Fukan Gozakara, who says Piers Morgan tried to justify what Israel is doing by saying, how does any country defend itself without committing war crimes? And so here's what John Mearsheimer had to say. This is what we hear a lot in the narrative of the collective West, of the neocons, right? That unless you commit war crimes, unless you meet so-called force with force, and I think even that's a simple oversimplification when it comes to what's going on in Gaza, you have to respond with equal, if not greater force, because that is for the greater good. So here's how John Mearsheimer answered that.
It's us off the hook.
How does any country defend itself from an existential threat like the Nazis, then by your categorization, without committing war crimes?
Well, if you look at how the Soviets, who were basically responsible for defeating the Nazis in World War II, they did not commit many war crimes in the process of defeating the Wehrmacht. It was basically a ground war where the Soviets, the Red Army, rolled up the Wehrmacht. There were no bombing of cities. There were no dropping of nuclear weapons.
So, in a sense, what John Mearsheimer is saying and responding to, because they've been talking about Israel, okay? They've been talking about what Israel is doing. And of course, Piers Morgan does that. I'm not for all of these killings of children, but war crimes are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen in response to October 7th. This has been Piers Morgan's justification for Israel from the very beginning. And John Mearsheimer right away pulls out a deep historical example and says the Soviet Union did not drop bombs on civilians to defeat Nazis. They did not do that. They did not drop bombs on civilians. What they did is they fought a ground war directly against Nazi forces and defeated them at the great cost of the Soviets, of the Red Army. So let's continue.
Now, there's no question that there was a lot of rape and pillaging, especially at the end, as the Red Army moved into Germany. But aside from that, this was not a purposeful campaign to murder huge numbers of civilians. So you can fight a war on the ground involving two armies that basically avoids the problem of bombing cities and murdering huge numbers of civilians.
What if the Nazis are bombing cities, as they were?
What do you mean? I'm not defending that.
Like the Battle of Britain, the Blitz. I mean, if they're going to send over bombers and just attack cities in the way that they did, how do you defend yourself without committing war crimes by your assessment?
Well, the British defended themselves with fighter aircraft. The RAF fended off the Luftwaffe and won the Battle of Britain. The RAF, the British, did not commit war crimes to defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. There's no question that the RAF, at different points in the war, purposely targeted German cities and purposely tried to murder large numbers of British civilians. You know the story of Bomber Harris for sure. Yeah. But that's not what happened in the Battle of Britain. And my only point is, if you talk about what Bomber Harris did and the RAF did against German cities, this was a war crime. They were purposely bombing working class areas in German cities.
A big one was Dresden. I mean, firebombing tens of thousands in the Royal Air Force, the RAF, as Mearsheimer is calling it, was absolutely was the biggest part to that. The United States helped out, but the British Air Force just absolutely leveled Dresden, killed tens of thousands.
Because that they believed that strategy would maximize the number of civilians.
Well, it wasn't as simple as that, were they? Because they were deliberately targeting industrial cities in the main, which were being used to build munitions as well. So there was a legitimate reason to target these cities. But that was the case in many cases.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
No, I mean, what happened was that the British quickly found out, and this is what happened to us when we bombed Japan. We quickly found out that bombing economic and military targets didn't work. I could walk you through the story about the bombing of Japanese cities like Tokyo. It didn't work. And the reason we turned to bombing civilians, to killing civilians when we bombed Japan, and this was true with regard to Bomber Harris, is that bombing economic targets did.
So that's one part of this, okay? And I thought it was brilliant to bring up the Soviet example because it is so true that the Soviets gave up basically everything to fight that kind of war. And, it cost tens of millions, 27 million Soviets died, but it did lead to a reduction. It wasn't the Soviets going in and just dropping bombs like Israel is doing on Gaza right now. So that is just no justification. And that is the narrative we keep hearing over and over and over again. So I want to play another. This might overlap because the segments were kind of hard to organize, but let me play you another segment here. All right. So here is more. Okay. No, let's not do this. Okay. Let's go to the Iran piece. So I think we got enough of Mearsheimer just absolutely blowing the lid off of how there's no justifications. What Piers Morgan was basically saying there is that you have to do what Nazis do in order to defeat Nazis. That is essentially the argument. So that's basically saying the Soviets, the United States, the Allies in World War II, that's what they did. Not so simple. Although the US, of course, committed grave war crimes in Japan, for example. But now we're going to get in the issue of Iran, because, of course, Piers Morgan takes a very hard stance on Iran and has been using Iran as a way to justify, of course, once again, what Israel is doing by putting a liberal face on it. And here is what John Mearsheimer had to say about the situation there. So here we go.
Israelis who started this by bombing the Iranian embassy in Damascus. The Iranians did not start this conflict that recently took place between April 1st and April 19th.
But they were there with people from Hezbollah, weren't they? So they were military leaders using the consulate to plan attacks on Israel with leaders of Hezbollah. I mean, that was why they were targeted.
Look, in international law and according to international norms, states don't attack the embassies of other states. This was considered to be a significant provocation.
Unless they're being used as military bases.
No. Piers Morgan keeps on doing this. This has been the narrative too from the collective West, from the foreign policy neocon establishment. What they say is that, of course, embassies are protected property, that under international law, there is to be no striking embassies during open conflicts, any kind of conflict, except, Piers Morgan and others will say, the apologists of war, essentially world war, these apologists, they'll say, except for if there's military planning. No, actually, it doesn't matter if there's military planning, if there's anything going on there, they're still protected. Every single U.S. embassy on this planet, every single one, is used for military purposes. There is not a U.S. embassy on this planet that isn't used for military purposes. And why is that? Because the United States doesn't do diplomacy. U.S. embassies in Colombia, all across Latin America, are used for military and intelligence purposes, all across the Middle East, all across West Asia. Try to go to a U.S. embassy in Saudi Arabia and tell me that there isn't military activity going on there. Go to a U.S. embassy in Israel and tell me that military activity isn't going on there. It's preposterous. It happens all the time. There have been literal coups in regime change operations that have been planned out of U.S. embassies. This was the case especially during dirty wars in Latin America and the Caribbean throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Ask Chile what role the U.S. embassy played in the overthrow of Salvador Allende, which installed Pinochet, the fascist dictator. I think Chileans would say, well, the U.S. embassy played a very nefarious role by essentially acting as a conduit for arms, training, intelligence. It happens. Operation Phoenix came out of so-called Indochina U.S. embassies in Vietnam and Cambodia. This is a long history. But here's Piers Morgan saying, oh, you can just bomb them. You can just bomb the U.S., Israel. They can just bomb embassies whenever they feel like there's military activity happening within them. Anyway, here's Mearsheimer to continue.
Which it is believed, certainly Israel argues, I don't know, but it's certainly been argued by Israel that it was being used, part of this consular area was being used as a genuine military base, in which case it becomes a legitimate target if indeed they are meeting with Hezbollah to plan attacks on Israel, isn't it?
There's no evidence that it was being used as a military base. And the fact is that if the Israelis are going to hit the Iranian embassy, the end result is the Iranians are going to retaliate. And they did retaliate. Now, I want to say a few words about that retaliation. It's very important to understand that the Americans and the Iranians orchestrated the Iranian attack so that it would be a limited attack. It would do very little damage to Israel. And the reason this is the case is that neither the Iranians or the United States wanted this conflict. And it was the Israelis who, by attacking the Iranian embassy in Damascus, dragged the Americans and the Iranians into this conflict. And what we tried to do, working with the Iranians, before the attack on April 14th and during the attack on April 14th was to do everything possible to keep it limited and avoid escalation.
So, I mean, John Mearsheimer just speaking the truth. I mean, John Mearsheimer, especially since the conflict in Ukraine jumped off, but but even more so since Israel launched its genocidal onslaught. You follow him on Judge Knapp's show and wherever else he's doing interviews. I've tried to get him on here, but very busy guy. But nonetheless, if you follow his work and his interviews, it's just become more and more solid on these issues. And when it comes to Iran, this is exactly right. This was a limited strike that Iran conducted on Israel that did penetrate the dome. It did cause damage to military installations inside of Israel, no matter how many times they try to say it didn't. But the United States and Israel were in deep communication through mediators, and they essentially agreed to a limited attack that wouldn't escalate the situation in the region and that would give Iran what it wanted, deterrence, and also give the United States a way out of further becoming beleaguered in some kind of quagmire that it already really is in. So this was the reality that Iran, throughout this iteration of U.S. and Israeli aggression, it has been the one to behave sanely and rationally with both reality and humanity and the region and Palestine all on its mind. Meanwhile, you have Piers Morgan trying to say, without any evidence, that Iran was planning military operations out of this embassy. And let's be real, of course, there was Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Of course, there were several military advisors, some of Iran's top commanders inside of the Al-Quds force, which is essentially the regional wide force which fights on behalf of the Palestinian people, as well as whichever part of this region is under siege from aggression, especially foreign aggression. It played a key role, of course, in the fight against ISIS and these jihadist groups, etc. So you could say, because they were there, that military activity was being planned. But there's no proof. And even if there was proof, it would still be a war crime. And it would still justify and warrant an Iranian response. So whoever demonizes Piers Morgan, people like Piers Morgan, when they demonize Iran for taking a rightful response to a war crime against it, one that was limited and one that essentially, in many respects, helped take the planet off the brink of a potential nuclear and regional disaster. For those like Piers Morgan who stir up the pot and try to demonize Iran, all they are doing is creating further conditions for something like this to happen again, for Israel to essentially have carte blanche, rubber stamp permission to commit war crimes of this nature, which takes us to the brink of a world war in West Asia, or at least a world war that has a focal point in West Asia. So that's the reality. But John Mearsheimer just absolutely was incredible in outlining these points to Piers Morgan, and just, I mean, this is just how it is for Piers Morgan, right? Just completely outclassed. There's just no, how should I say, no question about where Piers Morgan stands. There's no question about John Mearsheimer's intelligence on these matters. But I did have one more clip on this that I wanted to show, but it does overlap with one of the last ones, so I want to just fast forward through it. Here we go. Here we go. All right. So we're going to listen to one more clip from John Mearsheimer on this question, okay? So I just had to fast forward a little bit. Okay, it's not working for some reason. All right, let me refresh. Here we go.
If you categorize it all civilians,
Here we go. So we're going to get more into this question. So this can include what Israel did to Iran, right? And this can also include what Israel is doing to Gaza, because they're having this conversation about the broader situation. So here we go.
If you categorize it all civilian deaths in a war like that as murder, you're effectively saying that every one of those deaths is a crime. I would not argue that what the Allies did in response to what the Nazis and the Japanese were doing was a crime necessarily. They were responding to an existential threat to the world, including mass murder of civilians, as we saw with the Holocaust. So a response is not necessarily murder, is it? It's effectively self-defense.
The question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you think because the Nazis were committing genocide, because the Nazis were committing mass murder in Europe, that justifies bombing German cities and purposely killing huge numbers of civilians. Do you think that lets you off the hook? That's the argument you're making. You're saying that because the Germans were so horrible, we were allowed to be horrible ourselves, but we weren't as horrible as the Germans. And furthermore, we were doing this in self-defense. That's the argument you're making.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, I understand that there are strategic imperatives for killing civilians, right? This is why we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. We thought that it made good strategic sense and that it would save American lives, especially those GIs who would have to invade the Japanese home islands. But I still think that is a case of war crimes. And I think that to use your rhetoric lets us off the hook.
How does any country defend itself from an existential threat like the Nazis, then by your categorization, without committing war crimes?
Well, if you look at how the Soviets
all right, so that we already went through that part, but I think he did a masterful job of going over this point about how war crimes are war crimes and that there really is no justification for it. And World War II history is so important because one thing that's often not noted about World War II and about the US's behavior is that when those nuclear warheads, when those bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was already well known that Japan was gearing up to surrender, that the firebombing that the United States had already partaken in had crushed them, and that the Soviets, right, in the Manchuria region, for example, were marching. And the reason why the United States dropped those bombs because it did not want to give the Soviet Union credit for helping to end this war, but also wanted to send a message to the Soviet Union that the next phase of its empire was coming into fruition, which was the Cold War. That this was a message to the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union shouldn't get too comfortable being on the same side of the United States because that was going to be reversed very soon. That is the reason why the United States dropped those bombs. It was not to defeat Japan. Japan was defeated. Foreign Policy magazine of all places, look it up. They have discussed this. They have the receipts. This was the real aim. And all of this is to say is that war crimes are war crimes. And Israel always gets a pass, and the United States always gets a pass from people like Piers Morgan. There's always a justification. We have to defend democracy. We have to beat the Nazis. But that is never the case. The United States does not defeat Nazis. The United States helps strengthen their hand in places like Ukraine. The United States doesn't defend or promote democracy. It completely obliterates it in coup after coup and war after war all over the world. Is the United States truly bringing democracy anywhere right now? Is it bringing democracy to Gaza? Gaza right now is not just an open-air prison. It is an open-air prison that's being bombed to oblivion, where people are being massacred on a scale that we have not seen, right? That we have not seen in the modern era. If we look at it from at least from the arena of proportionality, like the proportion of people that are being killed in Gaza is just astronomical. And it's just so infuriating. It's so infuriating that people like Piers Morgan get this kind of morality pass that because they are giving some kind of liberal argument, they're against war crimes in general. They don't like what Israel is doing in some respects. And then they go up and I think it's kind of insulting. Speak to someone like John Mearsheimer, a political scientist of many decades, someone who's written dozens and dozens and dozens of books and articles, a real researcher, someone who's written about the Israel lobby in the United States. This is someone who knows his stuff. And you try to debate and argue with him about whether it's justifiable to commit war crimes. That's not even intellectually a valuable conversation. Because all you have to do is look at the UN Charter. All you have to do is look at international law, and you can see that there is absolutely no justification for any war crimes. Because, for example, if you look at, let's say, the right to armed resistance for occupied people, which is in the UN Charter, that resistance is not a war crime. That resistance is actually self-defense. War crimes are offensive operations, usually that are the result of brutal force from a more powerful aggressor. That's generally how it goes. Wars are never fought. Has there ever been a war fought in history where both sides are equally as aggressive, where they're equally at, can be said to have started this war? No. Usually wars are about one side trying to assert its interests over another. That's why you could say war in many respects is a reflection of class war, because geopolitics is basically an essentially class war among nations. It's about the bigger nations, the richer nations, the wealthier nations, those nations that are seeking unmitigated free access to profit accumulation, monopolization, economic expansion, and those who are not. That in many respects, that's how geopolitics is shaping out. China, Russia, Iran, these countries, they're not seeking unlimited expansion, because if they were, they would have expanded far beyond where they are now in terms of their national interests. The United States, though, the collective West, they're everywhere. They're in the Solomon Islands, of all places. They're everywhere. They are seeking to expand their economic hegemony at the expense of those nations. That is the nature of war. Israel, it's not fighting an equal party in Gaza. Hamas, as many people say, it doesn't have. Hamas and the Palestinian resistance, they don't have the same kind of weaponry. They don't even have a state. However, as has been the case in history, many nations that have been stateless, that have been essentially colonized, dispossessed, they have fought wars too. And they have committed acts that we would say, well, that may be morally repugnant, but it's not a war crime because it's resistance to occupation, to dispossession. This is the qualitative difference between empire and those who are besieged by empire. That is something that John Mearsheimer understands, and his attempt to articulate this to Piers Morgan was probably fell on lost ears or on deaf ears, but it didn't fall. But many people listened to it, and many people could see that Piers Morgan was just completely out of his league. So, all in all, we have to combat and push against this narrative that Iran, that Hamas, the Palestinian resistance are these kind of boogeymen in the region that are trying to destroy democracy so the United States and Israel can just do what they want in a way that's just more palatable. That's what Piers Morgan is trying to say. The United States and Israel should wage war on these forces. It just shouldn't do it in the way that it is doing it. This is why they're scapegoating Netanyahu. This is why they want Israel's government to change. It's not to stop the destruction of Gaza. It's not to stop the horrific war crimes that they're committing. It's just to take people's attention away from it, take people's eyes off of it all around the world, and make it more acceptable to the global population. I think that ship has sailed, but the project, the mission of the US empire, of the collective West, is ongoing, and Piers Morgan is the media talking head of that mission, the public relations person of that mission. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.